It was fun today to sing of the faithful love of God for us and how much we enjoy that and appreciate that faithfulness of God. And that's been Joseph's story, right? Joseph's story has been all about the faithfulness of God with him through so many things. But what about our faithfulness towards God? I can't think of anything better than walking a lifetime with the Lord. Just walking with the Lord. And some of you have done that. Lived your whole life walking with the Lord. Both my parents were followers of Jesus from their very first days all the way to their last breath. And life was not always easy, but God was with them through it all. Joy upon joy, blessing upon blessing, peace in the storms. Spiritual riches, fruitful ministry, generations of faith. You know, in my mom's final years, I got to spend a lot of time with her, and she was a widow, and she was living on about $1,200-$1,300 a month with no other assets. Suffered with osteoporosis and arthritis and compression fractures in her back, and eventually some dementia. So sounds like a lot of difficult things, right? But she often marveled, Dan, I don't know why I'm so blessed. She'd say that over and over again. She reveled in the riches of what truly matters. And my hope through this series about Joseph is that you too would know the wonders of having God with you. God with you. And so we come to the final chapter of Joseph's story, and really Jacob's story. It's recorded in Genesis chapter 50, if you want to find that. It wraps up with some significant scenes for father and son who walked with God. Jacob lived 147 years. That's a long time. He lived another 17 years in Egypt, his last 17 years, where his clan, his people prospered in the land of Goshen of Egypt, and his heart never parted from the covenant with God and the land that God promised them back in Canaan. And you may remember he made Joseph swear to him that he would bury him in the land of promise with Abraham and Isaac rather than being buried in Egypt. And he assured Joseph that God promised God would one day bring his people back to Canaan, the promised land. Well, when Jacob died, he was honored to receive the Egyptian embalming since he was father of Joseph, and there was this 30 days of embalming, and then with that 70 days of mourning. That was typical for in Egypt, and not everyone in Egypt was embalmed, only the elite. Anyway, Pharaoh granted Joseph's request to allow him to take his father's remains back to Canaan to be buried. And an amazing funeral procession transpired, and I think that's largely in deference to Joseph. Anyway, have you ever been in a huge, long funeral procession? Or have you ever been interrupted in where you were going because of a huge, long funeral procession? Sometimes when police officers or celebrities die, the route is blocked for people, for hundreds of cars, and police make their way, or people make their way, fans make their way to the cemetery, and it's quite an ordeal. The picture that you have there is Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral procession. Big event, big event. Probably won't be that big when I pass, but some of you know Sam Stone. He told me that once he was in a funeral procession and he wasn't following the hearse closely enough so that there was a little bit of a gap, and when they came through an intersection, the light changed, and a car came in and T-boned him on the way to the cemetery. Now, how is he going to get to the cemetery for the committal service that he had to do? Anyway, it was an ordeal. One time I did a funeral service, and the burial was 150 miles away in a small rural town. And so instead of taking all the friends and family in a funeral procession, we just set a time to meet the family at 2 in the afternoon, 150 miles away. So we had early morning funeral service, and then we drove over there, and we all met at the cemetery. Well, the funeral, I rode with the funeral director in the hearse, and at lunchtime, he said, let's grab a bite to eat, since we have plenty of time. And we rolled into this little town, and he said, now look for a restaurant where all the cars are. Look for where there's a bunch of cars. That'll be the best place to eat in town. And sure enough, there's a family restaurant, and it was packed, and the food was indeed good. But we pulled up there in the hearse, and we walked into that restaurant wearing our suits, a bunch of farmers and all kinds of people in there, and the place suddenly got crazy quiet. I mean, it was silent, and everyone is staring at us, and they were probably wondering whose body's in the back. Is there a body in there? You know, they're probably wondering all kinds of things. Anyway, I remember that funeral. Another time, I met a family at the cemetery for the service. We didn't meet at a church or a funeral home or anything. We just met at the cemetery. We had the service in the mausoleum, and then we put the casket in the back of the hearse. That hearse was parked in the wrong direction, parked this way, and all the other cars were going parked that way, and that's the direction we were heading. And so the director told me two things. One, that we're using a mock grave because the excess rain recently, and so the ground was too soft. So we're going to use this mock grave, and that's fine. I can do it. And then secondly, he had to turn the hearse around in that narrow little road. And then I was to get in that procession right behind me, which is typical protocol. The minister gets in behind the hearse. And so I got ready. As he passed by slowly. I nudged my way in there, and then all the other cars, all the family, got in line behind me. And we drove about 100 feet and stopped, and we were there. I mean, we could have walked the casket to the grave. I don't know what that was about. Well, after the committal, I asked him where the actual grave was, and he pointed right across the road, right there. Why couldn't we just have it there at the right grave, and why did we have it at this side of the road? That didn't make a bit of sense to me. Anyway, those weren't the craziest things that happened at that funeral, but I'll save that for another occasion. Anyway, Jacob's funeral procession was a sight to behold. If you can imagine, the trip from Egypt to Canaan was about 300 miles. So that'd be like something like walking from here to Chicago O'Hare's airport. Okay? So they had to walk and carts and things like that. Google says it would take 4 or 5 days walking from here to Chicago O'Hare. Probably take me longer than that, even with contemporary conditions and all, but that's a long way. Think about walking through the desert, 300 miles to Canaan. And so this royal entourage included many from Pharaoh's court and dignitaries from Egypt, plus all of Jacob's family, minus the children. And there were chariots and horsemen, probably both for honor and for protection on this journey. Well, they finally arrived at Canaan, and Joseph observed a 7-day mourning there with loud lamenting, the Bible says. And Genesis 50, verse 11 notes, when the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning, they said, well, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. You know, they recognize this is something significant going on here. Anyway, it was a spectacle. And then Jacob was buried with his fathers. And everyone returned back to Egypt. And I'm reminded that God is with us even in the end. He's with us even in the end. And He brings us into the promised land if we're His. Isn't that good news? Now, with Jacob gone, the brothers feared there would no longer be a buffer between them and Joseph. And so Genesis chapter 50 reports this, starting with verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" And so they sent word to Joseph saying, Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you badly. I don't know if Joseph said that or if they're lying, one way or other. That was their message. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of God your Father. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, Joseph wept. I think because even after all that had happened and all the grace and mercy he had shown them, his brothers still didn't trust him. And I think we need to realize how easy it is for people who have mistreated others to interpret another person's actions in light of their own guilt and weaknesses. Might keep that in mind. Anyway, I want to unpack this exchange with the brothers in a moment, but in this chapter, Joseph's story comes to a close. The following verses tells us that he died at the age of 110, but before he died, he gathered his older brothers that outlived him. He gathered his older brothers for a final word of assurance. And in chapter 50, starting with verse 24, then Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So he wanted to die. He wanted to be buried when he died back in Canaan. Well, he died, and he was embalmed, and his remains were kept there in Egypt until the day his people did return to the promised land 400 years later. They carried his bones with them in the Exodus. And so let's review this closing chapter, seeing some assurances of God being with us and some corresponding applications for us. Okay, so here's the first assurance. God is with us in struggles. The application is to be trusting. We've seen over and over the phrase, God was with Joseph. God was with him. When giving him his dreams in the future, God was with him. When he was sold as a slave, even as a slave, he prospered. God was with him. When he was unjustly thrown in prison, and even in prison, he prospered. God was with him, giving him interpretation to Pharaoh's dreams, and God was with him when he was appointed as overseer of Egypt with a plan to save the nation from the severe famine that God said was coming. God was with him, blessing him with a family and comfort and authority. God was with him in the restoration with his family and seeing his father again. And God was with him even in his death. God with him did not mean the absence of difficult trials, did it? A lot of times that's what we get in our heads. If God's with us, it's going to be good. But it doesn't mean no difficulty. But it meant an assuring presence, a plan, and a prosperity even in the worst times and places. Now, Joseph never took his eyes off the God of the covenant promise. And Joseph trusted that no matter what was happening to him, God was at work in his life for God's glory, God's purposes, for his people. And he learned to endure patiently, just trusting. It wasn't easy, but just trust. Now, even though we're not skydiving today, jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, we're not in the trenches in the battlefront, and we're not moving to China as missionaries, trust is still essential for our life. And whether you're facing devastating news or enjoying a mountaintop blessing, God is with us. Do you believe that? Relationship with God is what matters. For example, when Jesus was baptized, the heavens opened and the voice of God boomed, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Now, are you wondering, Lord, why are you so pleased with Jesus here? I mean, the heavens are broken open only 3 times in the New Testament in such a dramatic fashion, and God the Father speaks. So this must be very important, what he's saying here. Now, at this stage of his life, in Matthew 3, Jesus hadn't done anything yet. He hadn't started his ministry yet. He hadn't preached a sermon. He hadn't healed a lame person, opened the eyes of the blind. He did fulfill righteousness by being baptized, but that was it. So why is God so pleased with him? Is it his identity? Because he's related to the Father? This is my beloved Son. So what pleases the Father isn't all the stuff that we might do to serve him. I mean, that does please him, that's important. But what really pleases the Lord the most are people in genuine relationship with him. God loves us. God is with us, and when we are with him, trusting him, he's delighted. Hey, that's my daughter. That's my son. The evidence that God is with us is not how smooth and easy our path is. In fact, God becomes more visible when our life is full of setbacks and disasters, heartbreaks, and obstacles. And no matter how awful Joseph's life got, he knew God was with him and he trusted God for the final outcomes. And if you're struggling, don't withdraw from God, draw near. Trust him and experience his assurance, his presence. For me personally, when life feels dismal or scary, just knowing God is with me changes my spirit. You got to love Debbie Nair. She's been through more hardships than most of us. MS, cancer, strokes, amputations, many heartbreaks. But Debbie's positive spirit and trust in the Lord are unwavering. She's not dependent on her circumstances. Here's another great assurance and application. God turns evil to good. Be patient. Be patient. Joseph's true story is an example of this truth. He pointedly reminded his brothers, hey, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives. See, all the evil that was perpetrated against Joseph when he was just trying to do the right thing. I mean, God turned it all inside out in the long run. His brothers chided him when he shared the dreams that God had given him. They hated him so much they wanted to kill him because Dad loved him more than them. They threw him in a hole. Then they sold him as a slave. And they lied to their father about his whereabouts. So cruel. And God enabled him to excel in his work even as a slave, which caused Potiphar to prosper and in turn give Joseph charge of his house and affairs. But then Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. But when he refused to sin against God and Potiphar, she shouted, rape! And he was unjustly suffered for years in prison. Now, how do you turn that into something good? But God did. The warden put Joseph in charge in the prison because God was with him. And after helping a fellow prisoner, interpreting his dream about the soon release and return to his duties, the cupbearer got out and he forgot all about Joseph, never said a thing, causing him to languish even more years in dungeon. But when Pharaoh had strange dreams, the cupbearer remembered. No one could make sense of them, but God was with Joseph and gave him the interpretation. And God said abundance was coming, followed by devastating famine that would swallow up all the abundance, unless careful plans were made. And so Joseph was put in charge. He was made the premier of Egypt with authority and real legal lifestyle that went with it. And so in an instant, he went from the very bottom to the very top. God enabled Joseph to reconcile with his brothers. They showed up in Egypt because there was a terrible famine. Bad stuff's going on, but God was working. Pharaoh suffered these nightmares, but God opened the door to save Egypt and promote Joseph. God turns bad things into good. He wields bad things for good purposes. And he's able to turn evil to good, wicked betrayal and jealousy turned into saving millions and preserving Israel. God turned the cross of Jesus to victory and salvation for the world. God faithfully keeps his covenants. His hand is deeply inserted into the affairs of people, even evil doings, directing the flow for his good purposes. We simply have to be patient. And it's hard to do that. Heather made a lot of bad choices and ended up an addict. And even though she wasn't seeking God, he was seeking her. In anger, her boyfriend ran over her with his truck, and she lost a leg. And through the love and compassion of my friend's church in Mooresville, Indiana, she met Jesus. And she became his disciple. And she got sober. And she's now helping others get clean. And she has such an inspirational testimony. Now, God didn't cause her to lose her leg. But God used those terrible circumstances to get into her heart and to change her life radically. And for that, we can give thanks. Ecclesiastes 7:13 declares, "Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked." Now, the word crooked here is not in reference to something that is morally out of line. That's not the kind of crooked he's talking about. He's talking about obstacles in the path, hardship, trouble, difficulty that we wish we could change, but we can't. For example, we struggle with our physical limitations or diseases in our bodies, right? We can't change it. We suffer with breakdown in personal relationships. We have something that we wish we didn't have, or do not have something that we wish we did have. And sooner or later, there's something in life that we wish we could change. And what are you thinking of right now that if you had the power to change it, you would? I know something came to your mind. But we should take heart that God can make the crooked straight. Whether things seem crooked or straight in your life, we need to see our situation in terms of the sovereignty of God, the hands of God. Leave room for him to work. Be patient and trusting. Here's another assurance. God gives us meaning in suffering. And the application is to be discerning. Because suffering is difficult to explain why God allows it. You ever wrestle with that? Is it hard to wrestle with for you? Perhaps finding completely satisfying answers to that question? David and Nancy Guthrie named their baby Hope, even though there was little to be hopeful about. She was born with club feet, extreme lethargy, the inability to suck, among other problems, Zellweger syndrome. Now, this is a rare metabolic disorder characterized by the absence of cell structures that rid the body of toxic substances. There's no treatment, no cure. Most babies with this disease live less than 6 months. So Nancy blamed herself for not praying enough. But God used the tragedy to prompt Nancy to seek God hungrily. So as she studied the Word, as she studied in the book of Job, one passage stood out to her. That's where God said to Satan, hey, my servant Job will be faithful to me no matter what. Doesn't matter what you do to him. He's going to be faithful. And she longed for that, but she couldn't imagine that God would ever say that about her. I mean, how could she face the worst thing she could imagine in a way that was pleasing to God? But she made up her mind to try. Now, little Hope didn't get any better. The grief and the burden didn't go away. But with the Lord's help, Nancy's perspective began to change. She began to find ways to praise the Lord and testify about Him with her neighbors, with her supporters. Day 199, little Hope went to heaven. And so they decided that David would have a vasectomy to avoid any future pregnancies and suffering that were sure to come. But you know how medicine and science goes. She found herself pregnant again. And Gabriel was also born with Zellweger syndrome. In an interview in Time magazine, Nancy said, like Job, we often cannot see the hidden purposes of God, but we can determine to be faithful and keep walking toward Him in the darkness. Gabriel died on the 187th day. What we believe about God will be tested. It'll be tested. Do I trust God to turn evil to good? Can I grow and be faithful in suffering? Nancy said, I found out that I'm not strong, but God's grace is sufficient. So here's Joseph. He was learning. He was insightful. And he tried to share his faith with his brothers. He wanted them to see God's hand in their lives, keeping His covenant, working in their good and bad choices. I mean, if they would just open their eyes, they would see that God was saving their family and saving many, many lives. And when God is with us, we can learn some life-shaping lessons through our suffering if we will allow ourselves to consider that. Why does God allow suffering? Well, for one thing, He uses suffering to lead to critical results, furthering His plans and accomplishing His will. And secondly, He uses suffering to develop our faith and character. Peter said that we're refined by fire. We learn to rely on Him. We learn patient endurance. We learn to think unselfishly. We learn to pray. We learn how to help others who are suffering. We learn to worship even when we don't feel like it. We learn priorities and what is most important. We learn a whole host of things through suffering. Thirdly, God uses suffering to turn our hearts towards Him. Sometimes, when you're down, that's when you look up. Fourthly, He uses suffering to teach us obedience and to teach us the ugliness of sin. Number 5, He uses suffering to test our devotion. 6, God uses suffering at times to discipline us. And number 7, He uses suffering to enhance our testimony, because the way we suffer with the Lord can really have a positive impact on others. Number 8, suffering reminds us this world is not our home. So it makes us long for heaven more. Number 9, suffering also helps us appreciate Jesus' sacrifice and suffering for us on the cross. Number 10, this isn't really a reason, but we don't have the infinite mind of God. And we need to be reminded that we're not God. We can't always understand suffering, but we can trust that He is with us. And so when you go through a trial, reflect on what the Lord might be doing, what He might be saying to you. Well, another assurance. God includes us in bigger aims. Be opportunistic when that happens. Trust means knowing your life's purpose extends beyond your lifetime and your person. I mean, of all the things we talked about regarding Joseph's faith, what do you think the highlight is that really shows his faith? What do you think shows his faith the most? Well, is it his trust in God when he was sold as a slave? Or his refusal to commit adultery in that high-pressure situation? Was his faith most obvious of his endurance in jail? Or his confidence that God would give him an interpretation for Pharaoh's dream? Or his trust that God would lead him in governing all of Egypt through this terrible drought? What do you think it was? What is Joseph's great mark of faith? Well, Joseph was commended for his faith in Hebrews 11, but not for any of those good reasons. Not for any of those. God points out his faith because he recognized that God's purposes for his life extended beyond himself and his own lifetime. Hebrews 11, verse 22 states, "By faith, Joseph, when the end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones." Trust means realizing that God is up to something bigger than each one of us, than our lifetime can contain. Each one of us is a part of a larger story that is beyond our personal life, beyond our lifetime. And so Joseph saw it, and he told his brothers, hey, God's up to something bigger here than any of us. God's unfolding plans were to save the world. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychologist held in the German labor camps during World War II. He survived. He describes how he was without strength, but made himself get off his cot one morning. He'd tie his pants on with a wire, wrap string around his shoes to keep them on. He was so skinny. Given a crust of bread, he trudged over the frozen ground to labor gruelingly in the fields. And he thought he would collapse, but he kept going. How did he endure? He says that in his mind, he dreamed of using his survival experience to one day share with the world how to survive by thinking of what you could do to help others. And God allowed him to survive. And his dream became a reality as he has traveled the world sharing how to survive, and written a book, a bestseller, about sharing this experience. And his testimony, his insights have blessed many who are undergoing hardship. And if we think God, and if we think of blessing others, God can use our agonizing experience to speak into the lives of others, and we don't know how many lives will be impacted. What you suffer and what you overcome with God's blessing can play a role in where God is leading in this world. Maybe the saving of many, many lives for eternity. Maybe getting people to realize there is a God and that they need Him. Maybe to bring judgment on the rebellious and unrepentant. Maybe to extend His mercy and grace to those who don't deserve it but really need it. Your experiences, both good and bad, can be used by God to open doors and to help us communicate the gospel. You know, I love Bob Greene so much, and he's a joyful guy, and he endures his cancer with positive spirit, and he uses the opportunity to tell others about his joy in Jesus. And man, that's what we should do. Joseph saw it. God's goal was saving lives. He's with us. He's doing something special. Even from the covenant first given to Abraham, passed to Isaac, and then to his father Jacob. To him and all Israel, the covenant promised that the descendants of Abraham would be a blessing to the whole world. And Joseph's wise actions saved many nations from perishing in that famine. Many nations. He saved his own family, a family through whom God was bringing the Messiah to save the world. Joseph's experiences, even his suffering, served as a vital cog in the plan of God to redeem us, to redeem you and me. Chapter 50 ends with Joseph's death and the promise that God will one day deliver his people from Egypt and bring them back to the promised land. God had always said that, and Joseph was reminding them of that, and it sounds so promising. But I hate to burst the bubble. The very next words of the Bible in Exodus chapter 1, then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to all the people, these Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. So the reality is, God was with them, but for the next 400 years, Israel suffered, worked as slave, crying out to God, please remember your promise. Remember what you said. 400 years. Generations went by. They suffered unjustly, far more than Joseph ever suffered. Would they keep the faith? Was God still with them or not? Can we trust God is with us? And what might that look like? Maybe not what we thought. Maybe not what we thought. But it doesn't change the reality, the truth. Brothers and sisters, do you trust God to lead you out of Egypt, out of whatever enslaves you? Do you trust God to be with you, whatever situation you are now enduring? Do you trust God to be working on His grand plan in this world and you're a part of it? Do you trust Him to lead the Western Hills Church family to the promised land? Do you believe that? Will He keep His covenant with us? Is He with us? Do you believe it? Do you believe it? I believe it. Maybe you need to accept God's grace and let Him into your life, to be with you, to cleanse you from sin and turn your life around, to lead you to the promised land of heaven. And I pray that today you'll repent and be baptized, put your faith in Jesus if you need to do that. We're going to stand and we're going to sing our song of commitment. And if you have a public decision to make, I'll meet you in the front.